All right, welcome back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stCenturyWire.com. This is a live broadcast. If you missed any of the live broadcasts, you can catch us on the podcasting platforms like iTunes, like Spotify, like iHeartRadio, which is available on smart TV, on the app as well. If you have a plasma screen TV or Roku, you can catch us there. Amazon Fire as well. I believe you can catch us on iHeartRadio there and a number of other podcasting platforms. Thank you so much for rejoining us for this live broadcast. Now, our next guest is a senior researcher for the Global Policy Institute. He has been on the program before. His name is George Szamuely, and he's joining us on the live link right now. Hello, George.
Hi, Patrick. How are you?
I'm great, George. Thank you for joining us. It's a strange time politically in the world, particularly in the West, under the cover of COVID. Politics is not business as usual. It's being conducted on a virtual platform rather than a real one. So it's looking at the U.S. political scene. It's incredibly bizarre. I wanted to talk to you about your impressions of the Democratic National Convention. I think this is really important, and I'll tell you why, George, because this is the first time in history that our democracy in the West is being funneled through a digital pipe. So, yeah. What do you think about this? What were your impressions? I mean, how do you feel about this in general, from a political or democracy point of view? What we're kind of going through right now. What are your thoughts on this generally?
Well, to be honest, political conventions are not what they used to be. There was a time when the nominee of a party was actually decided at the convention. This hasn't been the case in decades. And it hasn't, and in decades, there haven't been any really interesting or controversial events. The last interesting convention that I can think of was probably 1972, the George McGovern Democratic Convention, not because there was any uncertainty as to who would be the nominee, but there were all sorts of interesting and unusual characters who came up to the podium. And it really wasn't tightly controlled in the way that conventions have been in recent decades. So in that sense, I don't think the change was that great. What was surprising was the poor production values of this particular convention. You would have thought that the Democrats, with Hollywood in their pocket and with Silicon Valley also largely in their pocket, would have churned out a very slick production. But instead, it was really very poorly produced, poorly crafted, and it really wasn't clear what they were trying to do. I mean, the point about a convention these days is, as I say, not in order to deal with the uncertainty as who will be the nominee, but to rally the base, get everybody enthused about the ticket so that they would leave the convention excited about November and ready to work for the party during the election. This wasn't done this time. The speakers that the Democrats chose were in large part Republican retreads who expressed their disgust with Donald Trump. The problem there was that, first, they had nothing to say that would actually enthuse the base. I mean, the base really didn't want to hear from Colin Powell and John Kasich and Brett McGurk and Mrs. John McCain. So there was that. Also, they were against Trump in 2016, so there was no new development here. If the Democrats had been able to produce some Republicans who had supported Trump in 2016 but had now turned against him in disgust, that would be one thing. But just wheeling out the familiar crowd of disgruntled national security types to tell us again what a horrible person Trump was, I think was a complete waste of time. But the second thing that was problematic is that the people who actually would excite the base, such as Bernie Sanders or AOC, were really given very short shrift. And that does seem to be puzzling, because whatever you think of Sanders or AOC, they do get the base excited. And giving Colin Powell more time than either of them, to me, made very little sense. So I felt that the Democrats really come out of this convention really without too many achievements. And I would be very surprised if they get any kind of a bump in the polls as a result.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you, George. I think it actually might have hurt them a little bit. It might have really turned off some of their kind of younger supporters. It was definitely the virtual convention, whatever you want to call it. It was definitely geared towards the older Democrat stalwart audience. Do you agree with me on that? Was it?
Absolutely. It was very much, as I said, all these John Kasich, Colin Powell, the lauding John McCain. These were elderly people, not the young people that you're supposed to get enthused, because they're the people who are actually going to do the party work, the people who get excited by AOC, by Ilhan Omar, by Presley, Rashid Tlaib. They're the people you want to energize, because they are the ones who are going to do all the work before the election. They didn't do that. And instead, they really brought on these elderly types whose message was, Trump is really terrible, and we want to restore the status quo ante. We want to go back to the good old days of Obama and Clinton. And it's hard to believe that the younger Democrats really want to go back to that. But it's particularly surprising when this was exactly the tactic that the Democrats used in 2016, which is Hillary Clinton will be the continuation of Obama. What we want is just restoration of Obama, and to a certain extent, a restoration of the Clintons. And nobody wanted it then. So it's surprising that 4 years on, the Democrats seem to think that the party wants it now.
Yeah, and with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they gave her a makeover. She came out in the kind of skimpy Nancy Pelosi cocktail dress, shoulders exposed, screen cut off at the chest, with American flag behind her, giving this kind of contrived, establishment delivery. So I think the machine, even her being processed through the Democratic Party machine, turning her into trying to give her a mainstream look, and a Pelosi type look. Maybe they're signaling she's the future, House leader one day potentially, or she'll run for the presidency in 2028. I'm sure at the earliest possible opportunity.
Yes.
But doesn't it show you, George, that with the oligarchy that really controls the Democratic Party, the media complex as well that's attached to it, and any rebels, any insurgents within the party, if they're any good at having any appeal, they're going to try to capture them and mainstream them, basically. What are your thoughts on this?
That's exactly right. The Democrats made their pitch to the donors. That's who they were trying to appeal to. We want you to send us our cash. There's not going to be any radical changes here. There was that wonderful headline in the Wall Street Journal, something like the nomination of Kamala Harris has relieved fears in Wall Street. So that's the Democrats' goal. Well, thank God Wall Street is happy with Kamala Harris. They know they have a friend in her. And that's really their pitch. And what is so surprising about this is that the Democrats had to win back the voters that they lost in 2016, those white middle class, working class voters, particularly in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, who had voted twice for Obama and had now gone over to Donald Trump. These are the people you have to go for. Not the donors. They've got the donors. They had the donors in 2016. They outraised the Republicans easily in 2016. But they had to get these voters who had abandoned them and had gone over to Donald Trump. And again, this is something the Democrats failed to do. They had no message at all for that middle class white American vote who are concerned about jobs. They're concerned about obviously the lockdowns and what that has meant to employment, but they're still concerned with what has been going on in recent years, which is outsourcing, shipping jobs overseas, the financialization of the economy, and their general replaceability by immigrant workers, whether illegal workers or by H-1B visa holders. Those were the voters that Donald Trump had appealed to successfully in 2016. And these were the voters that the Democrats should be appealing to. And instead, they had nothing to say to them.
Yeah, because, you're talking about, who's the most powerful demographic, what's the swing vote? What's the bloc that really elects American presidents historically, at least in the last, let's say 30 years or so, 40 years? Yeah. It's white suburban women. This is the most powerful demographic in America. So whoever can win over that. Now, I'm not saying that Trump's done a particularly good job there. He's definitely lost a lot of white suburban women in the last 4 years, mainly because of his poor bedside manner and the fact that, a lot of these people still watch CNN, a steady diet of CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post, New York Times. So they're going to get all this day in, day out negative coverage. But this message coming from the Black Lives Matter lobby, defund the police. Yes. And one activist said this during the virtual convention. We're going to abolish the police. We're going to abolish prisons. We're going to abolish ICE, the immigration service. How is that going to win over the white suburban women, the middle class women? So there's a real disconnect with this. They've used the angst from the George Floyd protests to generate media ratings for months and to basically set mobs really against the establishment or the White House, effectively. Yes. The Republican establishment. But is that going to really translate into the votes they need in November? That's the question. What do you think?
Well, I think it's an excellent question because, yes, the Democrats have a lock on the minority vote. They've played the George Floyd protests very well, and they're going to get the usual 90 to 95% of the African American vote. Democrats always get that. That isn't enough to put them over the top in the election, and particularly when there's really not that much enthusiasm for Biden. So, yes, the African Americans, of course, will vote for the Democrats, but unlikely to do so in the numbers in which they voted for Obama. They just can't translate into that enthusiasm they had for Obama. It doesn't translate into enthusiasm for Biden. But again, it goes back to that white middle class vote that is concerned about law and order. And when they see every night riots in cities, governors, Democratic governors, Democratic mayors being unwilling to deal with them firmly, and when they hear about soaring crime rates in New York City, in Chicago, and in other major cities, this makes them concerned. And this goes back again to what happened in the 1960s and 1970s when there was a sudden surge of violent crime. That white working class, middle class vote drifted over to the Republicans because the Democrats were seen to be either too weak to deal with the crime, or that they were seen to be secretly supporting it because they thought it might serve their political purposes. And I think that's what's happening today when it seems like these the Democrat mayors like Bill de Blasio and some of those, the woman in Chicago, they seem to be implicitly, kind of with a nudge and a wink, encouraging the protesters and the violence. And so I think that's going to turn off voters. I mean, it can't but turn them off. And, they may not like Trump, but they will still see Trump as somebody who will protect them far more so than the Democrats would.
Yeah, I think Trump's he's still in a bit of a bind because I think his success and Clinton's failure in 2016 was also to a large degree that the media, the pollsters, and because of the skewed polling and so forth, they didn't really take Trump seriously. So there wasn't that kind of alarm clarion call that, this is do or die, that sort of thing. I mean, they do have that do or die call on the alarm right now for this election. That they didn't really have it in 2016. They almost didn't take it seriously until the last couple of weeks.
Yes.
So he doesn't have that element of surprise. He does have the incumbency, but then his advantage of the incumbency has been basically ground away and almost dissipated by the COVID crisis in the last 6 months. Mm-hmm. Had there not been the COVID crisis, I think we're looking at a landslide right now, because of the economy would just be, firing off on all cylinders this summer. Major League Baseball going, everyone just having a great time. I mean, a shoo-in. So that's not going to happen. So he is actually. This is going to be with a low. I think there's going to be people not voting on both sides, Republican and Democrat, potentially a lower voter turnout also because of this issue with polls, in-person voting at polls versus mail-in votes. Just the fact that they're floating. What do you think about this whole mail-in post office controversy? I mean, the fact that they're floating that out to me is bizarre. I mean, isn't voting the most easiest thing to social distance?
One would have thought so. And really, there should be a quite simple solution to this, not the mail-in stuff, which is a very complicated and solution which will almost certainly lead to disaster, because all of our experience of mail-in voting is that it's rife for fraud and corruption. But then an easy solution would be, okay, let's keep the polling places open for 2 days, for 3 days. I mean, that's a much easier thing. I mean, if really we maintain social distancing, then let's keep the polling places open for 2-3 days. That could address all of those issues far better than the mailing. And but I think the Democrats see the mail-in voting as something that they can work better and that they could deal with more successfully than the Republicans. They are going all in for this mail-in voting. I think that would be a absolutely catastrophic decision. And I do think that the result would be that, we would just be debating the election outcome for months, if not years. I mean, we had the experience of 2016 when we're still arguing about Russia and what Russia was supposed to have done in 2016. Can you imagine what we'll be doing, with the mail-in voting and all of the questions that are going to arise as to which were legitimate ballots, which were not legitimate, which were legitimately discarded, which weren't. I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. But you're right about the issue of enthusiasm, and you got the sense from the Democratic Convention that the party leaders are really very, very concerned about the Democrat voters' reluctance to go out and vote. And hence this almost hysterical demand vote, 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 as if the people don't know that on election day you are supposed to vote. But somehow the Democrats are afraid that the lack of enthusiasm for the party ticket might lead their supporters to stay home and not vote. So despite the hostility to Trump and the passion that many Democrats have for ousting Trump and for avenging the humiliation of 2016, there's still a distinct lack of enthusiasm for Biden. I mean, it just goes back to the same problem they had in 2016, a terrible lack of enthusiasm for the party nominee who wasn't really seen to express the aspirations of the Democratic base. But I mean,
on the postal voting issue, we've had absentee ballots. That's a feature that's always been on offer for Americans forever, but it's always been a small amount of votes. So it's active duty military who are overseas, people who are working foreign service, U.S. citizens living abroad will vote by absentee ballot. And even if in every single election there are stories about uncounted absentee ballots. Every single general election that I can remember, there's always been a problem with that. But it's always been a minority of votes, so it's a small enough amount of votes that it wouldn't be enough, even if they were discarded or weren't counted, it wouldn't be enough to change the election unless they're all from like Florida in 2000, for instance.
Yes.
So I think what we're heading for, the problem with mail-in votes, especially if some states do it and others don't, especially if those are key swing states like Florida, like Ohio, like Michigan, like Wisconsin. The problem is it potentially is going to expand the window of the election process. So, it's not like voting on the day, November 3rd, and then you have the result in the morning of the 4th. That's not going to happen with postal voting. And what the Democrats will take advantage of here, George, is the instability of that situation.
Yes.
So they will mobilize street protests, MoveOn.org, and everything else that's putting people out on the street. Portland will burn to the ground like a Christmas tree, and Dad's a drunk chain smoker. Portland will be burned to the ground. So you'll have all of this instability. Then there'll be a 2000 situation where half the country will not accept the election results, and then it's going to go kick to some state Supreme Court.
Yes.
And then to the Supreme Court.
Yes.
I think we're looking at much worse than 2000, actually. This could be the nightmare of all nightmares for American elections. I have a very funny feeling, George, that we're heading into something really tumultuous in November. But your thoughts?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's exactly what's likely to happen. And the turbulence in the streets would have a political effect. I mean, just like, we've had the experience of the color revolutions in other countries where, suddenly, people refuse to accept an election result. They're out on the street. There's violence. People get killed and so on. And then the political authorities start panicking. They don't know how to respond. And, often they just cave in to the masses, the violent mob outside. And there's a possibility this could happen. I mean, if there really is the violence in Portland, violence in New York, that courts might just be, in a frame of mind, just to, let's just, adopt a path of least resistance. Let's just, give it to the mob because they're the ones who are angriest, and they're the ones who need to be appeased.
Yes.
So it could be that somehow, Supreme Courts, state Supreme Courts, maybe even the U.S. Supreme Court will just make a decision to appease the loudest, most violent, and most hysterical voices protesting the election result. But of course, the outcome of that would be that the other half of the country will not accept that result. And then there could well be the kind of violence that you get in countries where there's a color revolution. Where, some bunch of people are now in power who, whether they won the election or not is very dubious, but whatever, in other part of the country absolutely refuses the legitimacy of their seizure of power. So I think that's very likely to happen. And I think the Democrats are counting on the fact that they're much better at protesting and at screaming louder than anybody else than the Trump supporters. And I think that that's exactly what they're counting on.
Yes, and the Republican Party becomes the party of regions
right.
at that point.
Yes, exactly.
So the theme of today's broadcast is basement hawks. So one of the things that you pointed out earlier was all of these national security experts that came to endorse Joe Biden. You had all the sort of neocon hawks who signed on to that. That's not a big surprise. I mean, we saw, the Mitt Romneys, the John Boltons of the world have all kind of, dispensed with Trump. So this brings up a question. If Joe Biden manages to win in November, what would a Biden administration, what would the foreign policy picture look like? What would the cabinet look like? What sort of things would the Washington consensus be pursuing at that point?
Well, I think you just have to look at the people who are currently around Biden and advising him on foreign policy. You have this hawkish woman, Michelle Flournoy. She's likely to be the defense secretary. You have Nicholas Burns, who is remember him as from the 1999 bombing of Yugoslavia. He was involved in that. He was involved in the Iraq invasion. He's been around forever. He's likely to get a very big job, maybe Secretary of State. You have Susan Rice. We know all about her. You have Samantha Power. You have Tony Blinken, another kind of Obama-Clinton stalwart. These are the people who will be around Biden. And they are really not making no secret of their agenda, which is restoration of the status quo ante. What they call, quote, American leadership of the world, unquote, means more regime change operations, more hostility towards Russia, and more of the kind of cozy corporate deals from which they all make a ton of money. I mean, these are all very, very rich people. They've been making a ton of money for years and years, moving in this murky world of hedge funds, strategic advisors, corporate boardrooms, think tanks, and private equity firms. They move in this world, so their kind of foreign policy agenda nicely lines up with their pockets. They make a lot of money from all of the various deals that they urge. So we know that they would be signing all kinds of cozy economic deals with Silicon Valley, with the aerospace and the arms manufacturers. They serve on the boards of all of these, but for instance, in the relations with China, all the countries in which they do very nicely through offshoring and outsourcing. Again, that's what you would get from this foreign policy team. So, if you think of the Obama administration, you think of the heyday of, let's say, the Clinton years, when there was this wonderful moment when at one and the same time, the United States was demanding regime change in 4 different countries. Syria, Assad must go. Libya, Gaddafi must go. Egypt, Mubarak must go. And Yemen, Saleh must go. We saw the catastrophic results of that. And we can be sure that this will continue in the Biden administration. I would think it's quite likely that they will renew the war against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. They're very resentful that they failed in that. And other places that they would continue with regime change operation. They would almost certainly get more involved in Ukraine. They're already making all sorts of ridiculous assertions in Belarus, which is, heating up an already volatile situation. So, if you liked some of the Obama years, I think that you're going to have a great time during the Biden years.
How do you think will there be any change in terms of Washington's orientation towards Israel and how things are developing there? Obviously, Trump is Israel's best friend on so many levels for what's happened over the last couple of years. But would that status quo remain, or would Washington get even closer to Israel, or how would you see that playing out?
That's a good question. Some people are expecting a Biden administration to return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was the nuclear deal with Iran. I don't believe it for a moment. I think that's a done deal, and I think Biden will just continue with the Trump policy. And while the Biden administration will probably be not as warm and as gushing towards Israel as Trump has been, I also don't think there'll be any significant changes. I don't think that there'll be a return to Tel Aviv as the seat of the U.S. Embassy. I think that'll be taken. That's it. It's a done deal. So I actually don't think that there'll be any real change towards Israel, just other than on a personal level, there probably just it won't be as warm as it has been under Trump. But if you remember, during the Obama years, for all Obama's apparent irritation and dislike for Netanyahu, essentially he didn't do anything hostile to Israel's interests. I mean, even when Israel openly insulted Obama by building settlements when they pledged not to, Obama didn't do anything about it. And I think that the same will apply now. So all of the pro-Israeli policies that Trump has pursued, the Biden team will just take it in the bank and work with it. They're not going to change any of that.
Yeah. So Kamala Harris is absolutely, joined at the hip with IPAC.
Exactly.
Biden's very pro-IPAC, but like you said, I don't see a big change there. Plus, there's also an opposition to Israeli policy that's kind of international. It's always going to be there, but you don't have that same opposition in the kind of liberal West to hawkish policy against Russia or against the Eastern Bloc, and so they can kind of get away with whatever. Under a democratic, I mean, Trump's sanctioning Russia to the hilt, and no NATO aggressive policies, no change there, no dovish policies there. But I think the aggression we saw under the Obama administration towards the Ukraine, for instance, showed that they're very, very, adept and willing to kind of go all out to undermine or to destabilize Russia's Western perimeter, Western frontier, and push Europe further east. So looking at the situation that's come in Belarus in the last week or the last 2 weeks, that's interesting. I mean, if you have a Democratic presidency, that could really flare up if that was to go a little bit further. First of all, what do you think about the situation? Do you think a color revolution has legs in Belarus, and could it be emboldened by a Biden presidency?
I think it does have legs, and the Europeans have been playing a very reckless game. They're already pouring a lot of money into Belarus. I mean, he's pouring $50 million. That's an awful lot of money in a country that is quite poor. So they're kind of whipping up the opposition. They're whipping up the kind of anti-Lukashenko fervor in the hope of really making trouble for Russia. I mean, somehow that if gets down to a complete chaos internally, if there is some outbreak of civil war. Some troops go over to the opposition, some troops don't. then there'll be a pressure on Russia to do something. Russia cannot allow Belarus to become a kind of NATO satellite state. They cannot allow it. This is just too vital to their interests to allow a kind of a de facto NATO ally, right there, within a few miles of Moscow. So that's the European game, and I think that's the Americans are involved in this, and it's a reckless policy in the sense that it's not going to help the Belarusians in any way, shape, or form, because at a certain point the Russians are just not going to tolerate this. But they feel that it works to their advantage because it gives Russia headaches, it provokes Russia. It gives NATO a raison d'etre. Oh, look how aggressive Russia is. Therefore we need more resources for NATO. And I think that I think it's a dangerous situation. I think it will get worse under a Biden administration. I mean, I think that they will try to pull a Ukraine color revolution type in Belarus. We saw how absolutely disastrous that was for Ukrainians. They lost Crimea, they've lost a large chunk of their territory. But for the US and the EU, they think, hey, job well done. We've created a rift between two states that are basically, joined at the hip and should be allies and friends. So job done. And I think they're trying to pull the same thing in Belarus. Disastrous for Belarus, but in terms of NATO policy, it has a certain cynical geopolitical strategy behind it.
Yeah, it's interesting. The the opposition candidate, I think she's gone into exile to Lithuania now, and in kind of Juan Guaido fashion.
Yes.
I think it won't be long before the U.S. and the Britain and other EU countries start to recognize her as the legitimate president of Belarus. So in that sense, following the Venezuela, pantomime template. I don't think she won the election. I don't know what you think about this, but knowing how conservative Belarusians are generally, she may have got votes in some of the cities, but overall, I think the heartland, the traditional vote carries the weight of any election there. So I don't think she would have won, even if there was irregularities. Even 100,000 people on the street doesn't represent a country of many millions. In terms of voting, but so she's in exile. But she leaked her platform before they took the website down. We got a hold of it via Southfront.org, and it's very specific, decoupling Belarus from Russia's military alliances like this CSTO, pushing them into NATO and the EU. They're very specific about their demands. Svetlana. Tikhanovskaya, I can't even pronounce her last name properly.
Right.
So, have you looked at any of this? I mean, I think this is a major operation. What are your thoughts?
No, that's absolutely right. And they're doing the same thing that they did in Ukraine, which is that they're cultivating this fake Belarusian nationalism. I mean, the Belarusians, white Russians, are Russians. I mean, they're one people. The whole idea that they're a separate nation, well, it was first of all this idea was cultivated by the Bolsheviks, who kind of created all sorts of artificial nations, in large parts in order to suppress Russian nationalism, which the Bolsheviks always, well, first of all, they disliked and had disdain for what they called greater Russian chauvinism, but they also always saw Russian nationalism as a threat to Bolshevik rule. So they created a whole bunch of nations out of whole cloth, one of which was Belarus. And of course, NATO has been very eager, NATO, all the Western powers, have been very eager, of course, to accept the Bolsheviks' artificial creations. And so, just like the Bolsheviks, they now say, oh, yeah, Belarusians, that's a separate nation. That's a separate state. And they're very eager to cultivate it for much the same reasons the Bolsheviks did, which is, hey, we can use this very nicely against Russia. It's not likely to be as successful as it was in Ukraine, because there is a kind of a very virulent strain of Ukrainian nationalism, which comes, in the western part of the country, the parts that used to be part of Poland, that really does have a deep animus towards Russia. That doesn't exist in Belarus, but that doesn't mean that the West won't try to cultivate this Belarusian nationalism as much as possible. I mean, they tried that before 1994. I mean, George Soros poured a lot of money into Belarus, particularly in language development. I mean, Soros really wanted to cultivate the Belarusian language, which didn't go anywhere because everybody speaks Russian there. So, I agree with you. I don't think that she won the election. I think it's just extremely unlikely that was. But I think that it's quite possible that at some point the United States and the United Kingdom, and then down the road, Germany and France will recognize her as the, quote, legitimate, unquote, leader of Belarus. And then, of course, again, that just creates headaches for the Belarusians, and of course, it creates headaches for the Russians. Doesn't do the Belarusians any good, but again, the Europeans may think that this is quite useful for them. But let's keep in mind, the Belarusian economy is entirely integrated with the Russian economy. I mean, everything that's produced in those giant factories in Belarus goes to the Russian market. So the moment somehow Belarus moves towards the West, all of those factories are going to close down, because there's no way that the goods that they manufacture will be of any interest to anyone in Europe. So these factories will close down. They'll be sold to the Western corporations for a song, and millions will suddenly be out of work and living in the kind of misery that Russians were living in during the 1990s, which incidentally Belarus avoided. And so that is certainly a great achievement on the part of Lukashenko, that he avoided that whole kind of crazy crash capitalism that prevailed in Russia in the 90s and prevailed in other parts of the former Soviet Union. So Lukashenko's achievement that he avoided all of that. Workers had jobs, and people were paid on time, and it was it's been a fairly efficient, relatively prosperous place, vastly superior in many ways to Ukraine, which has been beset by one crisis after another ever since independence in 1991.
Yeah, initially in the breakup of the Soviet Union, much like Russia, Belarus was overcome with organized crime. There was a little bit of an initial economic shock, and crime and corruption was a big problem. And then a government was formed, and they managed to get control of it to the point now where crime is so low in Belarus. It is one of the safest countries in the world. You can leave your car unlocked in Belarus, in Minsk, and it won't get broken into. I mean, that's how things have changed there. So definitely, I think people generally should be happy about that. Certainly, I think the traditional voters who do remember the shaky times appreciate that sort of thing. I don't think the West appreciates it. But isn't what's likely going to happen with Belarus is they'll do the whole Juan Guaido charade with Svetlana. She's the new rightful ruler of the country. So then they'll put Magnitsky sanctions or something on all the Belarusian oligarchs and anybody connected with Lukashenko. And then so what's going to happen? It's just going to push them even closer towards Russia.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I think then the Union state that was, they created this treaty in 1999, but hasn't been implemented since 1999, largely on account of Lukashenko, who enjoys his kind of independent status. Now I think Lukashenko really will have no choice but to move forward with the Union state. And because, he really has no allies or supporters in the West. I mean, it's a very strange policy that the Western powers have adopted, because during the past year or two, they've been cultivating Lukashenko as, in order to create headaches for the Russians. There was Pompeo. He visited Belarus earlier this year. The United States opened an embassy in Minsk. And of course, what happens soon after you have a U.S. embassy open somewhere? There's a coup. I mean, it's like it follows like clockwork. You have an embassy, next day you have a coup on your hands. But what is interesting is that having cultivated this policy of, well, let's see if we can prise Lukashenko and Putin apart, they didn't continue with it. They abandoned that policy and suddenly went back to the old policy, which is Lukashenko's a dictator. He's the last dictator in Europe. He's the worst person imaginable. We must sanction him. We must get rid of him. So, it's kind of incomprehensible why, you abandon one policy and then adopt another, which can only lead to one consequence, namely that Union state will come into being, because there's really no alternative in Belarus. Russia is now going to accept a color revolution in Minsk. Lukashenko has nowhere to go. He has no allies in the West anymore. He will have to just accept the terms of a union treaty, and so that will be the consequence of this policy.
That's interesting. So it could be an own goal, much like the Maidan coup was an own goal for the West. So the German Marshall Fund has been after Belarus for a few years. I've been studying, going back, looking at their archives. So they've been prodding and funding and doing all the things behind the scenes to undermine the government there, and then to promote this youth upswell, this color revolution. And so they're really kind of in their stride right now, the German Marshall Fund. And they were also very active in the Ukraine as well. I think they back Klitschko as well, I think. Yes. So they're an interesting, they're in there along with Radio Free Europe, and you see the same actors there. And we're talking to George Szamuely, author of Bombs for Peace. There's a link to his book on the show page as well. It's about the war in Yugoslavia. So do you think, George, I think your book obviously is quite relevant now, because there is a potential for instability, but clashing between the West, between NATO and Eastern European and Russian states. So what are the odds? Last, before we wrap up here, a lot of people are going to be asking the question, George, and you're a historian, so you might be able to answer it. Are we heading towards potentially, the red alert level in the coming years based on what you're seeing now, or is there going to be a different kind of metamorphosis in terms of the tension between NATO and Russia and its allied states?
I think that it's a very serious situation because this rebellion or refusal to accept the election outcome is continuing and growing in strength. It's continuing and growing in strength in large part because the Western countries are pouring a lot of money in, and they have every interest in fueling discontent and opposition within Belarus. And the longer this continues, the more likely it is that there'll be some kind of a provocative act, whether the Belarus security forces react with excessive force, or whether there'll be some kind of a staged assassinations, staged sniper shooting. Then there'll be some kind of a serious political crisis. And at that moment, some civil war could break out. I mean, and then Russia will be certainly facing a serious problem as to how they should respond, and it'll be just a very, very bad situation. And you have to think that the Western countries are playing an absolutely reckless, foolish, dangerous game here that cannot possibly end well for anyone, least of all for the Belarusians. And the Western countries know this. They know perfectly well that Belarus is absolutely vital for Russia's security interests. They know perfectly well that Belarus would suffer an economic catastrophe if it was prized away from the Russian world, and yet they're going ahead with this. And irrespective of the disasters that this would create for Europe itself. I mean, we're just talking about the flow of immigrants and the kind of the flow of instability into other countries. So one would have to say that this is an absolutely reckless policy, and if there is a Biden administration, then things could take a sharp deterioration, after January.
Yes, because I don't see, for all of its faults, I do see the Trump administration has definitely, I mean, there's sanctions everywhere, and of course what's going on with Iran and the maximum pressure campaigns on, for economic sanctions on Venezuela, Syria, and Iran are harsh, but they've backed off of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was the main feature, I think, of both Obama and Clinton presidencies, and the Bush presidency for that matter. So the Trump administration has backed away from the responsibility to protect the humanitarian intervention doctrine. So I think we'll probably see a return, or at least an attempted return to that with if Biden was to win.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very likely. Responsibility to protect. Susan Rice, Samantha Power, they wholly believe in this, and they would certainly try to implement something like this. And Belarus is a very good candidate for them to try to do some variant of that, as is Syria. I think that, as we were talking earlier, there's unfinished business there. I mean, these Obama retreads are still angry and frustrated that their plans to topple Bashar al-Assad failed. And I'm quite sure that they will try to revive that. But certainly Belarus would be a prime candidate, particularly when you think of the malign influence of George Soros on the various people whom he has funded over the years, who are very interested in prizing away from the Russian world. Well, at first it was Ukraine, but now they're very interested in prizing Belarus away from Russia.
Yes. Well, there's a lot to look forward to, or not, depending on what the result, I guess, of the November U.S. election is. If there is a result, that's another whole thing that's might be up in the air through the new year. Perhaps we'll see. But we want to thank you very much for joining us this week, George Szamuely, author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. He's also a senior researcher at the Global Policy Institute. Thank you so much, George, for joining us.
I enjoyed it very much.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is George Szamuely, and we're going to be talking on the other side of the break to our roving correspondent for culture and sport, Basil Valentine. So stick around. This is the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We will be right back.